A powerful blast of fire struck the massive stone fortress, the last dungeon finally collapsing. Amidst the chaos, a knight, his sword gripped tightly in hand, grit his teeth in defiance as he glanced over his shoulder. The fortress was crumbling, but the real danger was the terrifying army of ghosts with glowing eyes that were relentlessly pursuing them. With a commanding voice, the knight urged his comrades to move faster toward the exit, a fierce grin on his face. He warned them, if they slowed down, none of them would survive. The pursuing phantoms, their forms shrouded in red smoke, were enraged, convinced that these intruders were responsible for the destruction of their sanctuary. The knights, tense and out of breath, glanced back to see the swarm of spirits gaining on them. In the distance, an explosion erupted, sending waves of flame scattering in all directions. A massive armored knight, his shield raised high and spear in hand, turned to defend his comrades, standing tall as a barrier between them and the oncoming horde. One of the fighters, surprised by the turn of events, halted and raised a hand, calling out to his brave protector. Munyo, the protagonist, smirked sarcastically at his teammate, his white armor gleaming under the heat. With a mischievous grin, he extended his finger toward them and joked that whoever made it out alive would have the honor of writing his biography. Elsewhere, in a bustling city, people moved quickly through a busy pedestrian crossing, unaware that they were not alone. Among the crowd, two individuals collided by accident. One, a fair-haired man, turned, irritated, at the figure he had bumped into. A man cloaked in black, his face marked with strange hieroglyphs and a glowing red eye. The man froze, his confusion turning to shock as he realized the stranger wasn't human at all. The cloaked figure, a demon, smiled darkly at the human's reaction. It wasn't just humans who had built civilizations. Beneath the surface, demons had created their own. With a sudden burst of anger, the demon lifted large stones with his magic, sending them soaring into the air. His power was unmistakable. The city trembled as a gigantic gray hand, massive and monstrous, rose from the ground, followed by a ferocious beast, its purple chains rattling as it emerged. Panic swept through the streets as people fled, helpless against the coming invasion. Floating high above, the demon with the red aura watched as his monstrous army advanced. The invasion of the demons had begun, and humanity faced its greatest threat yet. The grotesque creatures with multiple glowing eyes had emerged from the depths, intent on wreaking havoc. Despite humanity's attempts to fight back with tanks and artillery, nothing could stop the demons. The demon with the red aura pointed at his monster, and with a surge of magic, the beast exploded into the air, its power overwhelming any resistance. But the tide was about to turn. A squad of demons, their aura dark and purple, witnessed an unexpected shift as a bald man stood among them. He radiated bright blue magic as he clapped his hands, and before their eyes, new figures appeared, humans with blue auras, each emanating extraordinary power. These individuals, gifted with superhuman abilities, had emerged to stand against the demon invasion. They were humanity's last hope, a group of superhumans, armored and wielding powerful axes, launched into action. One golden armored hero struck down a massive beast with ease. One by one, the superhumans cleared out the demonic dungeon, and for the first time, a glimmer of hope shone through. A squad of them stood before a rift in space, a purple aura swirling around it. This was the final dungeon, the last stronghold of the demons. The 7 strongest superhumans had gathered, preparing to enter the heart of the battle. In the spring of 2005, they made their move. The 7 heroes, clad in their advanced armor, entered the final dungeon. Rays of white light struck the last demon, signaling the end of the war. The demons were defeated, their underground empire shattered, and the long conflict was finally over.
These 7 superhumans were hailed as the saviors of humanity, each one with their own unique abilities and traits. A black limousine pulled up to a crowd of journalists, eager to capture the moment. The 7 saviors stepped out, greeted by
the cheers of fans and the flashing of cameras. They had become icons, their names synonymous with victory. But there was one hero, Munyo, who had not returned from the final battle. His sacrifice had saved many, but he had not lived to see the rewards that came with the others' triumph. A monument stood in his honor, a white cloth draped over it. 2 surviving heroes watched as the cloth was removed, revealing the inscription, "In memory of Munyo, leader of the 7 saviors." A group of heroic warriors stood in solemn silence, their gazes fixed on the monument dedicated to their fallen comrade. The air was heavy with grief as the white cloth that once veiled the statue was lifted, revealing the face of their lost friend. The 6 surviving heroes stood together, their expressions a mix of sadness and pride. This moment marked the end of a chapter for them, as their fallen companion had become a legend, forever immortalized in stone. 17 years had passed since those fateful days, and the city of Seoul now buzzed with excitement as the state arena hosted an international competition. South Korea was up against France, and the atmosphere was electric. The sun shone brightly over the stadium as the commentator's voice rang out, describing the intense battle unfolding on the field. France's star player, Nathan Bernard, was dominating the game, sending South Korean players flying with brutal strikes. The commentator's voice faltered as Bernard, using his red aura, unleashed an overwhelming series of attacks. His strikes were swift and deadly, leaving a trail of defeated opponents in his wake. Bernard's black silhouette moved through the air with grace and precision, dispatching each opponent with ease. His agility was unmatched, and he had single-handedly eliminated all 6 of the South Korean team's players. On the sidelines, a man in a black suit watched with a stern expression. The hologram of Bernard flickered above the arena, a visual testament to his impressive victory. The commentators exchanged words, marveling at Bernard's prowess and wondering aloud if anyone had ever reached such heights in the International Combat League. The match seemed all but over when, out of nowhere, a figure clad in red armor appeared.
It was the final hope for the South Korean team, a fighter named Bayan Hayan. With her whip crackling with red energy, Hayan launched herself into the air, determined to take down Bernard. The crowd held their breath, waiting for what would surely be an epic clash. But Bernard, ever the arrogant and cold fighter, didn't flinch. As Hayan closed in, he dodged her attack effortlessly, his speed and precision overwhelming her. She stood stunned, unable to react fast enough, and Bernard struck, his blade cutting through her, leaving her covered in blue light, a clear sign of her defeat. The commentator's voice echoed through the stadium, confirming that Hayan had fallen and that the South Korean team was finished. With a final flash of blue, Bernard's victory was sealed. The commentators announced the crushing defeat of South Korea, with Bernard taking the life of every player on the team. The match ended in a disheartening score of 0-11, a blow to the pride of a nation that had once been a beacon of strength and heroism. The spectators, once full of hope, were now disillusioned and angry. How could their nation, home to 2 of the world's greatest saviors, have fallen so far? A man in a black suit, the head coach of Beak Joe, stood off to the side, his face shadowed with frustration and regret. The scoreboard displayed the humiliating score in favor of France, and the weight of defeat hung heavy in the air. The commentators, their faces reflecting the disappointment of the nation, lamented the loss. South Korea had once been a force to be reckoned with heroes like Moon-yob and Jaeho emerging from their ranks. Yet now, their athletes seemed unable to rise to the occasion. The coach clenched his fists in despair as the crowd's displeasure echoed around him. The commentary turned somber, noting that despite France's impressive performance, the match had left a bitter taste for the South Korean people. The nation, that had once been a shining example of strength and resilience, had now been reduced to an afterthought in the world of competitive combat. As the commentators continued to discuss the match, the bitter reality settled in for everyone watching. The 9 final remarks from the crowd were filled with frustration. How had South Korea, with its rich history of heroes, fallen so low? How could esports competitions be taken seriously if their athletes couldn't even put up a fight? Only Hayan, the last survivor, had shown any real promise, but even she had been no match for the ruthless Bernard. The defeat was a harsh reminder of how far the nation had fallen since its glory days. The crowd in the stadium erupted in anger, shouting bitterly at the players, accusing them of disgrace after the crushing defeat. Fans voiced their frustration loudly, cursing the team and demanding they leave the field. The spectators, their faces twisted with disappointment, were seething with regret. They had paid to see their champions compete, only to witness their humiliating failure. As they continued to express their outrage, the team's fate seemed sealed. On a distant hill, Jaeho, dressed in his sharp black suit, stood watching the scene with a look of deep discontent. The head coach of the national team, a former hero among the 7 saviors,
observed the glowing blue lights emanating from special computer modules embedded in the ground. He couldn't escape the weight of his nation's loss. This was their third consecutive defeat since Yahello had taken the reins as head coach. The failure stung, and he knew it reflected badly not just on the team, but on him as well. Inside the facility, Heian sat in front of a virtual reality module, furiously ripping off her helmet. Her frustration was palpable as she powered off the system. Her teammates approached, their faces grim, their shoulders slumped in defeat. The reality was clear. Heian was the only one who had shown any real promise. The rest had fallen short. Yahello watched from above, feeling the heavy silence that had descended on the room. His eyes followed his team, now scattered and defeated, heads hanging low in shame. Once, Korean superhumans had been known for their strength, resilience, and tenacity, but now all that was left was a hollow shell. Yahello shoved his hands into his pockets, turned his back on his team, and began walking down the dark hallway, lost in thought. The current crop of players lacked the mental fortitude, the drive, the very essence of what it once meant to be a hero. The true warriors, the ones who could make a difference, had long since moved on, leaving only shadows behind. Yahello's mind wandered to his fallen comrade, the main character, the one who had perished in battle. The loss still haunted him, a reminder of how fleeting greatness could be. As he reached the trainer's room, Yahello paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He took a long, deep breath, exhaling heavily as he silently greeted the memory of his deceased friend. Inside, a photo of the 7 saviors in their youth caught his eye, a reminder of the glory days. But now, that glory seemed like a distant memory. Yahello's fingers trembled slightly as he straightened his tie, gazing at the image of Moon Yob, a face full of potential, now gone forever. Just then, the door opened, and a young man with curly red hair entered. The guy, slightly nervous, informed Yahello that the interview was ready. Yahello sighed, his shoulders sagging as he straightened his jacket. "Time to face the music," he muttered, preparing to leave the room. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, giving him a weak smile. The red-haired assistant, trying to stay optimistic, asked about the state of things, but Yahello wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "You think we have a chance with this lineup?" Yahello responded bitterly, his voice laced with sarcasm. "The team is broken. We've lost before we even started." As Yahello walked toward the exit, the assistant, growing more desperate, tried to lift his spirits, reminding him that he had only just taken over the role of coach. But Yahello, his face etched with exhaustion, couldn't bring himself to share the same optimism. "If a miracle doesn't happen, we're done," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The assistant continued to argue, his words growing more frantic, but Yahello remained resolute. "A miracle? What's left to believe in?" he snapped. "Moon Yob would have had to come back from the dead for us to have any hope." With that, Yahello opened the door and stepped out into the cold, dark corridor. His mind made up. He knew what needed to be done. This was his chance to step away from the job he had taken on with so much hope. The pressure was too great, and his team was too weak. He had already made up his mind. Suddenly, Yahello's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it out, seeing that the president of the association was calling. He sighed heavily, anticipating yet another lecture about the loss. "Great," he muttered under his breath, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Yahello!" The president's voice boomed through the speaker, full of urgency. "There's news, important news. You need to hear this right now." Yahello rolled his eyes, expecting more reprimands. "Yeah, I bet the news is that I've ruined the country's reputation on the international stage," he responded bitterly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But the president wasn't finished. No, this is big. You're not going to believe it." Yahello froze, his face hardening. The president's words rang in his ears. "The main character, the hero you lost, he's back." Yahello's eyes widened in disbelief as the president continued. "His body has fallen from the sky, right at the monument. People are turning toward the square. Something incredible is happening." Yahello's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as the words sank in. The main character, the very person who had once been the cornerstone of their team, was alive. The air around Yahello seemed to freeze, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Gwanghwaman Square was filled with confusion and unease as an unexpected sight unfolded before the crowd. A figure in heavy armor plummeted from the sky, crashing onto the ground near the towering monument of Admiral Yan. The crowd, already gathered around the monument, gasped in disbelief as the fallen figure lay motionless at the foot of the statue. This was no ordinary person. The monument beside him was dedicated to Moonyob, the legendary hero whose image had captured the same malicious grin he had worn 7 years ago. Moonyob had sacrificed himself during a battle to save the lives of 6 heroes, and now, against all odds, his body had fallen from the sky. People stood in stunned silence, recording the bizarre event on their phones, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The armored figure, barely conscious and battered, remained on the ground, eyes closed in exhaustion. The crowd recognized him immediately. This was the same Moonyob they had come to revere, the hero who had disappeared after his heroic sacrifice. Yahello, still in a state of shock, stood frozen in place, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He was too stunned to move, his mind struggling to process the impossible reality unfolding before him. The president of the association, frantic, shouted into the phone, urging Yahello to comprehend the situation. "Yahello, can you hear me? Are you deaf? Do you not understand what's happening?" The president's voice crackled, filled with urgency. Despite the president's frantic words, Yahello remained silent, unable to form a response. His body refused to move as he stared at the screen, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene. Moonyob, the fallen hero, sat near his own monument, his breathing shallow and labored. His eyes fluttered open slightly, and a faint, eerie grin spread across his face, the same smile that had once sent shivers down the spines of his enemies. His eyes glowed with an unsettling blue light, a sign that he was far from the man he once was. The crowd around the monument, still in disbelief, could only watch in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of the situation. The impossible had just become reality, and no one knew what to expect next. The president of the association repeated the unbelievable news. Moonyob had returned from the dead. A brilliant blue energy spread through the dark, void-like space as the protagonist faced an overwhelming wave of demons and monsters, each more vicious than the last. Blood dripped from their twisted forms as they closed in on him, and Moonyob bared his teeth in a mix of fury and determination. He quickly turned to face the demon chasing him, drawing a sharp sword radiating with blue energy from his side. His heart raced as a horde of nightmarish creatures swarmed behind him. With an intense, anger-filled gaze, Moonyob extended his hand, and a gleaming weapon materialized from thin air. The weapon, a spear-like polearm, solidified in his grasp, the hilt glowing with a pulse of blue light. He gripped the weapon tightly, his resolve hardening as he glared at the advancing monsters. Hatred burned in his eyes, and the blue energy from his glare seemed to intensify. The demons, their fiery red eyes glowing with malice, met his stare with equal fury, ready for a battle they knew would be brutal. Moonyob stood tall in front of the dungeon's gate, a black silhouette in the eerie darkness. He raised a shield in one hand and held the spear in the other, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The demons with red auras approached him, their growls growing louder, and Moonyob braced himself. He spread his feet wide, ready to defend against their relentless attack. His expression was one of contempt as he watched them approach, knowing that this would be a fight to the bitter end. The protagonist's eyes snapped open, and suddenly, he was no longer standing in the midst of battle. He shot up from a hospital bed, disoriented and confused, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. He looked around, trying to piece together the events that had led him here. He groaned, holding his head in his hands, overwhelmed by a sense of loss and confusion. The nurse, wearing a badge around her neck, stared at Moonyob in shock. She had been watching over him, surprised to see him awake. The protagonist glared at her, his hand still on his head as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. He asked her, his voice gruff, where he was. The nurse, still stunned by the situation, blinked and replied, "You're in the hospital." Moonyob's frustration grew as he tried to grasp the situation. He turned his gaze to the calendar on the wall and froze. The year displayed on it was no longer 2005, but 2022. His heart sank as he processed the impossible reality that 17 years had passed. How could this be? The last time he remembered, he had descended into that dungeon in 2005, not knowing what would happen next. The nurse, seeing his confusion, crossed her fingers and smiled ironically, as though she had expected his reaction. She understood that Moonyob was in shock, so she took it upon herself to explain what had transpired during his absence. Reaching for the remote control, she switched on the TV, her gaze inquisitive as she motioned toward it. A male news presenter appeared on the screen, addressing the audience with a solemn tone. "We are now moving to a breaking news segment," he announced. Moonyob, the leader of the 7 saviors, who was presumed dead for 17 years, has suddenly returned. He is currently being treated at a medical facility. The nurse, her face a mix of surprise and disbelief, looked over at Moonyob, who listened intently, his eyes narrowed. The news segment cut to footage of the protagonist's fall from the sky, landing near the monument that bore his likeness. The presenter continued, describing how Moonyob had apparently fallen from the heavens, landing at the base of his statue, unconscious. Eyewitness accounts confirmed that the hero was wearing the same armor he had worn when he last entered the demon dungeon in 2005. Despite his extraordinary abilities, Moonyob had not changed at all over the past 17 years, the presenter remarked, further deepening the mystery surrounding his return. Experts speculated that this might be due to a space-time anomaly, though no one could explain why he had been gone for so long or how he had returned. Moonyob stared at the screen, his confusion deepening. He struggled to comprehend the events that had unfolded during his absence. It felt like no time had passed for him. One moment he was fighting in the dungeon, the next he was lying in a hospital room, his world turned upside down. The nurse, noting his bewilderment, raised her eyebrows and gestured to the window. "That's why there's a bit of a chaos outside," she explained. Moonyob's gaze shifted toward the window, where a crowd of journalists had gathered, their cameras trained on the hospital. The nurse explained that reporters had been camped out there, waiting for any news about the hero's sudden return. Moonyob frowned slightly, irritated by the frenzy outside. He knew he was no longer the man who had entered that dungeon all those years ago. He gestured for the nurse to bring him a mirror, and she quickly complied, handing him a small, oval mirror. Moonyob studied his reflection with confusion, his fingers brushing over his face. He looked the same, unchanged, despite the passage of 17 years. He sighed deeply, understanding that something far beyond his comprehension had occurred. At 47 years old, he still looked as he had at 30. It was clear now, this wasn't just a return from the dead. This was something far more complex, something involving a space-time anomaly. With a grim expression, Moonyob realized that the world around him had moved on without him, and he was left to navigate this strange new reality. Moonyob was baffled by his situation. It didn't make sense to him. 17 years? An anomaly like that seemed impossible. He considered that if this really was the future, things must have changed drastically. His mind raced as realization hit him. He stared at the nurse in front of him, his body trembling with frustration. With panic in his voice, he demanded to know what had happened to his fortune and his money. The nurse looked at him with confusion, not understanding the depth of Moonyob's distress. When she reminded him that his will had left all of his assets to a fund for orphans, the weight of the situation truly hit him. His home, once a celebrity's mansion, had been turned into a museum. His beloved sports car had been auctioned off, the proceeds now long gone. He had nothing left. As Moonyob absorbed this crushing reality, his eyes widened in disbelief. He had been reduced to nothing, a man with no wealth, no home, and no belongings. His fists clenched with fury as the frustration built inside him. He pounded the blanket, the noise sharp in the quiet room. The nurse, though sympathetic, could only offer empty words of reassurance, reminding him that he had saved humanity, that people would not let him suffer. She promised to call Yahello, who had already been informed of Moonyob's condition and would be arriving soon. The day outside was bright and peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil Moonyob felt. He looked out the hospital window, taking in the unfamiliar cityscape. It was all so hard to believe. Was this really the future? The reflection staring back at him in the glass was the same. He hadn't aged a day. His mind struggled to grasp the idea that 17 years had passed, while to him, it felt like only moments. He needed answers, and Yahello was the one person he could turn to. His attention shifted to his own body. Moonyob's eyes glowed a faint blue as he activated his analyzing gaze, opening a system window to examine his condition. The system provided detailed information, analyzing his abilities and potential. He could see not just the present state of his body, but what he could become in the future. His mind wandered to the battles he had fought, imagining himself in armor, fighting monstrous foes, his body surrounded by a blue aura. It was through this ability that he had grown faster than anyone else, clearing dungeons and gaining renown. He had led teams of dungeon explorers, but something was still missing. He remembered his younger self, so full of doubt, and Yahello, then just a friend, a persistent one. asking him to teach him the ways of combat. Moon-yob had never seen Jaeho as someone with great potential, but over time, he realized the strength his friend had within him. Jaeho's persistence had paid off, and soon, they became part of the Seven Saviors. Moon-yob's mind returned to those early days when Jaeho had been a mere student, and Moon-yob had thought little of him. But Jaeho had proved him wrong. He had become a powerful force in his own right. Now in the present, Moon-yob examined his abilities again, noting his enhanced willpower, 110 out of 100. It didn't make sense. How could he have surpassed the limits of human potential? His focus then shifted to a new skill he hadn't seen before. It was called Immortal, granting him immunity to death from physical harm. Moon-yob's confusion deepened. This skill had never been in his arsenal before. Had it manifested as a result of the last battle? He couldn't be sure, but it seemed like the only explanation. As he sat contemplating, the door to his room creaked open. Jaeho entered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Moon-yob raised an eyebrow in mild surprise, recognizing his old friend. Jaeho's face softened, his eyes welling up with tears. He had never imagined he would see Moon-yob again. Moon-yob, always with a sharp tongue, couldn't help but tease his emotional friend. He smirked and remarked that Jaeho had become too sentimental in his absence. Jaeho, still overcome with emotion, wiped his tears and chuckled through the pain, agreeing that it was indeed a time of peace outside. Later, the two friends climbed to the roof of the building, the city lights casting a soft glow over the horizon. The night was still, and they stood side by side, sipping coffee in silence. Moon-yob glanced at Jaeho, a smirk still tugging at his lips. He couldn't resist poking fun at Jaeho's emotional display. But deep down, despite the sarcasm, he was glad to have his friend back. The bond between them, forged through years of struggle, was something that couldn't be broken, even by time itself. Under the quiet night sky, two friends sat side by side, sipping their coffee in silence. Moon-yob broke the calm with a sarcastic smile, teasing Jaeho about how, as he grew older, the tears seemed to flow more easily. Jaeho, with a sheepish grin, nodded, knowing full well that Moon-yob had yet to understand what time had done to him. "Come on, do you remember the promise?" Moon-yob said, his finger pointed accusingly at Jaeho, holding his cup with an exaggerated flair. Jaeho blinked in confusion. "What promise?" Moon-yob gave him an almost amused look, his grin widening as he reminded Jaeho about the biography he was supposed to write about him. Jaeho chuckled, realizing his friend was right. "Right, that," Jaeho said with a smile, his eyes lighting up as he recalled the absurdity of the task. "I even hired a top-tier writer for it. It's going to be a masterpiece. Of course it should start with my birth, right?" Moon-yob said, raising an eyebrow, sarcasm dripping from his tone. Jaeho couldn't help but laugh at the playful jab. "Exactly," he said, explaining that in addition to the book, there was also a documentary and even a film based on his life. While the content itself was nothing spectacular, both the film and the documentary had become global blockbusters. Moon-yob gazed upward with an expression of mixed disdain and confusion. He was wearing the standard hospital pajamas, still grappling with the fact that 17 years had passed in a world so foreign to him. He had died, only to wake up in this strange, unfamiliar future. "I can understand all of this logically, but it's just hard to believe," he admitted, glancing over the illuminated city below. Jaeho watched his friend closely, noticing the mix of disbelief and anger in his eyes as Moon-yob continued to stare at the city. "Even though I saved humanity, I feel like a stranger in my own world," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. Sensing the weight of his friend's thoughts, Jaeho placed a hand gently on Moon-yob's shoulder. "Don't worry, you're not alone. You've got a friend who's got your back, especially when it comes to money." Moon-yob turned to look at him, a sarcastic grin forming on his face. "Let me guess, you've made a fortune from those good old raids and your post-war bonuses, haven't you?" Jaeho rubbed his neck sheepishly. "Well, I do have some good savings, and I did manage to invest it well, let's just say. I didn't want to just sit on the money." Moon-yob looked at him in amusement. "Invested it, huh? And how's your business going with you running it?" Jaeho hesitated, then scratched the back of his head. I'm not exactly running the show myself. I hired professionals." Moon-yob couldn't help but laugh at his friend's honesty. "So you're still working, kinda. Unemployed but with a title." Jaeho, slightly embarrassed, shot him a look. "I do have a job. I'm the head coach of the national team now." Moon-yob perked up at this news. "Wait, really? You? A coach?" Jaeho took out his phone, almost nervously, and pulled up a live stream of the final match between Germany and France in the European Esports Championship. He handed the phone to Manhwa, explaining, "This is it, the battle of superhumans. These are the players with powers, the ones who fought in dungeons and now fight in virtual arenas." Manhwa looked at the phone in confusion, still not quite getting the concept. "Wait, these aren't dungeons we cleared back then? And what's with all these people fighting like it's some kind of game?" Yahello nodded. "Exactly. This is the new reality. A sport where superhumans showcase their powers in these battles. It's huge now, bigger than anything else." Manhwa sneered. "Seems like nothing more than a waste of time. It's all just a big joke." Yahello, however, defended the sport. "You're wrong. The top players now are almost as revered as the Seven Saviors. They bring national pride with their victories." Manhwa looked down at the phone with indifference. His lips curled into a slight sneer. "Not serious enough for me." Yahello laughed nervously, then took a deep breath. "By the way, we're not exactly in the best position when it comes to this competition." Manhwa raised an eyebrow, looking more intrigued now. "Not the best? What do you mean? With all the superhumans here, we should be at the top." Yahello, looking a little sheepish, avoided his gaze. "Well, not quite. South Korea's at the bottom right now." Manhwa's face twisted in shock, and, without thinking, he tossed his empty coffee cup over the edge of the roof. It fell with a loud crash on the stone below. He turned to Yahello, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "What did you just say?" Yahello looked down at his friend, his expression sad, but understanding. "Yeah, we're last in this competition." Manhwa's eyes widened, and he stood frozen in place, his mind racing as the weight of Yahello's words sank in. This was not the world he had expected to return to. A sleek black limousine sped along the busy highway, crossing a bridge under the cloak of darkness. Inside, Yahello broke the silence with a philosophical musing, commenting that when great evils are vanquished, the one who defeats them often becomes just as corrupted. The protagonist, Manhwa, sat silently in the front seat with his arms crossed, frowning at Yahello's cryptic words. His voice was tinged with curiosity as he asked, "What exactly are you implying about me?" Yahello, eyes fixed ahead on the road, casually threw his hand back behind his head, without diverting his attention from the wheel. "Our country," he said, with a slight edge to his tone, "has become the weakest in this sport for that very reason." Manhwa, displeased, shot a skeptical look at Yahello. "And you understand the gravity of that, don't you?" he retorted. The car raced forward, its headlights slicing through the night as Manhwa's gaze drifted out of the window. Yahello continued his explanation, his hands firmly gripping the steering wheel. "After the war, superhumans became a threat to the authorities. There were no more demons to fight, no enemies to justify our strength. They began fearing us, the very swords they once wielded as protectors, and so they sought to control us." Manhwa raised an eyebrow, his tone laced with sarcasm as he commented, "Seems like nothing ever changes with these people." Yahello's expression hardened as he looked ahead. "It's the truth," he said with a quiet resolve. "The superhuman battle game is heavily regulated, all under the guise of protecting society from destructive power. Even I'm not exempt from it." Manhwa's gaze grew distant as he stared out the window, lost in thought. "I noticed this even back then," he said with a hint of bitterness. "All the strongest superhumans just left the country. They either became players or coaches elsewhere. It was always the same." A faint chuckle escaped Yahello as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I'm sure you remember all the vultures circling us, trying to use us in one way or another. It's almost like we should have just broken their knees back then, huh?" He looked over at Manhwa with a knowing grin. Manhwa's arms flung wide in exaggerated frustration. "You know," he muttered, "if I said half the things I think about the president and the politicians, it wouldn't be enough." Yahello's grin widened in the rearview mirror, his eyes gleaming with understanding. "And this is why things are the way they are. They tried to control us, and because of that, the level of superhuman talent in this country remained abysmally low." As the car zoomed forward, Yahello's eyes remained fixed on his old friend. He couldn't help but smile at the thought of how far they had come. "I was actually thinking," Yahello began, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "that maybe we could turn this around. I've got an idea that could work if you're willing to give it a shot." Manhwa immediately cut him off, his voice stern. "I already know what you're going to say, and no, I'm not interested." Yahello blinked in surprise. "I haven't even said anything yet." Manhwa's sharp, irritated tone cut through the air. "You were going to drag me into this sport, weren't you?" Yahello glanced over at him with a look of genuine confusion. "But why reject it so quickly? You're only 30 at the peak of your powers." Munyob turned his gaze away, eyes dark with frustration. I'm not wasting my life. Don't drag me into this. Jeho studied his friend carefully, anxiety creeping into his expression. But this is different now. There's no debt, no pressure. It's just sports. Munyob's indifference was palpable, and he gave a slight snort in response. Debt? You're not one to fight for others, he said bitterly. Jeho let out a heavy sigh, his eyes closed as he leaned back slightly in his seat. When I was younger, he began quietly, I fought because I had no choice. I fought to survive, to earn respect in the world I was raised in. After discovering my abilities, I had to fight to prove my worth. He glanced at Munyob with a faint trace of regret. But now, I don't want to live that way anymore. Munyob turned his gaze toward the window, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He finally spoke, his voice tinged with frustration. It's time I started living for myself, he said firmly. He crossed his arms tightly and gestured toward Jeho, imagining the headlines that would soon follow. His mind painted vivid pictures of the media's reaction, speculating that even if he transitioned into the world of sports, they'd never stop labeling him the savior of Korea. The world would continue to hold him on a pedestal, forever tying him to a narrative he no longer cared for. Jeho, listening intently from the driver's seat, was silent for a moment, knowing exactly what his friend meant. He turned his head slightly, sensing Munyob's inner turmoil. You think they'll keep pushing you, don't you? Jeho asked, his voice soft but knowing. Munyob nodded, bitterness in his tone as he continued. They'll raise everyone's hopes, make them believe that Munyob will swoop in and save the day. It'll never end. His words were filled with a palpable frustration, the media's relentless expectations suffocating him. Jeho gave him a look of sympathy, yet Munyob could see the faintest glimmer of curiosity in his friend's eyes. What about the thrill of battle? Have you never thought about that? The adrenaline? The rush of competition? Jeho's voice was a mixture of enthusiasm and challenge. Munyob's response was sarcastic, almost dismissive. I'm tired of playing the clown for everyone. I've had enough of that life. His words cut through the air, and Jeho, sensing the depth of his exhaustion, fell silent. The car sped through the night, the city lights blurring as they drove, in quiet tension. As the minutes ticked by, Jeho's thoughts shifted. But, he began carefully, trying to find the right words, you can't just give up on everything, right? The country's strongest superhumans, they're not all that bad. Munyob seemed unbothered by the statement, turning his gaze toward the window, lost in his thoughts. You think so? He muttered. Jeho, undeterred, continued. As long as they have someone strong on their side, like that female fighter, their prospects aren't doomed. He pointed toward a banner outside, showing a woman with dark hair and a bob cut, her fierce expression capturing the attention of anyone who passed by. She's got what it takes, Jeho added. Munyob's eyes widened in recognition. Wait a minute, that's my daughter, he said, his voice almost a whisper, filled with disbelief. Jeho turned to look at him, confused at first, then realizing what Munyob meant. The realization hit him hard. This was Hayan, his daughter, now a grown woman, strong and determined in her own right. Munyob felt a surge of pride mixed with astonishment. She must be 23 now, Jeho remarked. Munyob laughed quietly, though his smile was tinged with bitter sweetness. I remember when she was just 6. She's grown into something remarkable. The mention of his daughter seemed to stir something deep inside him, and for a brief moment, Munyob seemed to forget the weight of his past. Their car soon arrived at a sprawling building. They had reached Jeho's home. Munyob stepped out, stretching his limbs as they made their way toward the entrance. Jeho's wife, a poised woman in a brown dress, greeted them warmly. It's been far too long, she said with a smile, her eyes lighting up as she embraced her husband's old friend. You've been gone for so long, but you look just the same, Munyob joked, though there was a hint of melancholy in his voice. Jeho and his wife shared a brief, tender exchange, with him thanking her for the warm welcome. The evening unfolded, with light-hearted banter and laughter, as Munyob playfully interacted with Jeho's wife. She joked that the week away had somehow aged her, but Munyob, ever the sarcastic one, only teased her back. You don't look a day older, he said, though his tone was filled with affectionate sarcasm. Sui, always with a kind word, remarked on Jeho's unchanged charisma. You're still the same man I remember, just as charming, she teased, prompting a bashful smile from Jeho. As the night continued, Munyob found himself growing more at ease, his earlier frustration beginning to fade. But still, he wondered what he was meant to do next. He was back, but what did that truly mean? The world he once fought to survive in was behind him now. As the couple's warmth enveloped him, he realized he'd truly returned to life, a peaceful existence now within his grasp. Later, as they sat in the living room, Munyob absent-mindedly flipped through the channels. He froze when he saw a familiar program playing on the screen. It was the drama, Stairway to Heaven, a show he had started watching years ago but never finished. His eyes widened in disbelief. "No way," he muttered under his breath. Yahello from the corner of the room couldn't help but grin at the sight of his friend's sudden excitement. "Looks like fate brought you back to finish it," he teased. Manhwa jumped up from the couch, eyes alight with shock. "I can't believe it! This is destiny!" he exclaimed, his voice filled with a mix of joy and irony. "I finally get to see how it ends." Yahello rolled his eyes but smiled at his friend's enthusiasm. All right. I get it. Go ahead and enjoy the drama," he said, settling back on the couch. He had brought snacks, fully intending to watch the show to its conclusion. For a moment, everything felt light and absurd, a brief escape from the complexities of life. Yahello, concerned, reminded his friend, "You've got a lot of other things to figure out, like, your life goals." But Manhwa didn't miss a beat. "There's nothing more important than this right now," he said, digging into his bag of chips as the opening theme played on the screen. Yahello, slightly frustrated but amused, realized his friend wasn't going to let this go anytime soon. Just then, a knock at the door broke the moment. Yahello, now distracted, glanced toward the window where he could see the swarm of journalists gathered outside. "Great, they've found us," he muttered under his breath, the media buzz growing louder by the second. Manhwa sighed, rubbing his face in exasperation. The journalists, relentless in their pursuit, had followed him here, and it seemed there would be no escaping their gaze. The tension in the room was palpable, but despite the pressure mounting outside, Manhwa knew what needed to be done. He stood up, resolute. "We'll deal with them," he said, his voice steady and determined. Yahello nodded, silently acknowledging that this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The next day, Moob stood with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring grimly out the window. He turned to Yahello, his voice cold and determined. "Gather all the journalists. It's time they hear it from me directly. They need to stop bothering me." They were standing in front of a towering multi-story hotel, its silhouette nearly lost in the thick clouds overhead. The blinding flashes of cameras filled the air as reporters scrambled, their microphones thrust forward. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, waiting for the elusive Moob and Yahello to make their appearance. Everyone expected him to stay hidden, perhaps forcing them to wait weeks just to get a glance. One journalist whispered to another, speculating about Moob's temper. "When he's upset, I hear he flips tables," he said. "I wonder what we'll see." Today, Moob straightened his back, his expression steely. He was done with the games. Taking the microphone, he looked around at the sea of expectant faces and said, "You all know I'm back, and I'm just as surprised as you are by the attention." His voice was sharp but controlled. Yahello watched from the sidelines, his lips curling into a smirk as Moob spoke with his usual sarcastic flair. Moob went on, remarking that the media's obsession with him was getting out of hand. He couldn't care less about their expectations. "Ask your questions," he said, gesturing toward the crowd of journalists, "and then leave me alone for good." Yahello sighed, knowing that Moob hadn't changed a bit, still as blunt and uninterested in diplomacy as ever. The questions came fast. One reporter asked how Moob had survived the final dungeon. Moob's answer was flat. "I woke up in the hospital. That's all I know." The crowd shifted, intrigued but unsure how to take it. Another reporter asked about the 17 years he'd lost. Did he remember any of it? 2005, Moob responded with a shrug. "Feels like just yesterday." The room was thick with murmurs as another journalist asked if he had stayed in touch with the other heroes from the last war. "No," Moob answered without missing a beat. "It was just business, nothing more." A few more questions flew at him, but he barely seemed interested. When asked if he planned to demand compensation for his years of service, Moob's response was a blunt no. Then an elderly man raised his hand. His voice cracked as he asked if Moob had considered entering the world of esports. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Moob glanced at him, annoyance flashing in his eyes. "No," Moob snapped, his voice edged with contempt. "I have no interest. I'm not here to entertain you or anyone else." The elderly man, undeterred, sneered and asked if Moob thought he was incapable of doing it. Moob's lips curled into a sarcastic smile as he shot back. "If I were you, with that receding hairline, I'd probably think the same thing." The audience tensed. Moob leaned forward, his fingers gripping the microphone, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't like esports, and I'm not here to be anyone's clown. I'll do what I want, when I want." With that, he concluded, "That's all. Thanks for the questions, but this press conference is over." Rising from his chair, he gave a half-hearted wave before turning to leave. Yahello, who had been watching from the side, smiled wryly. "Thank you for your time, everyone," he said in a showy voice, his tone dripping with mock politeness. Suddenly, a shout rang out. "Wait, we have one more question!" A reporter wearing glasses stepped forward, extending his hand toward Moob. Moob paused, eyebrows furrowing in confusion. The journalist explained, Gerald Walker, the American esports legend, had something to say about you. He claims the glory of the Seven Saviors is long gone, and that you never managed to defeat him. Moob's expression shifted to one of mockery. Gerald who? He asked, clearly unimpressed. The reporter elaborated, introducing Gerald Walker as the best American tank player, but not among the top 3 in the world. He showed Moob images of the top players, Nathan Bernard from France, Roy Meir from Ireland, and Daniel Mank from Germany. Moob raised an eyebrow as the images flashed across the screen. So Gerald's not even top 3, he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. And you're telling me about him now? Moob rubbed his forehead in disbelief. After all these years, this is what you bring me. He's not even in the running. He straightened up, his posture firm as he addressed the crowd. Gerald wants to challenge me? Fine. He doesn't get a game. If he's so eager to face me, he can come here and tell me to my face. With a contemptuous sneer, Moob pointed directly at the camera. I'll bury him in the garden with my own hands. On the other side of the world, a man in a white suit watched the broadcast. Zachary Wood, a senior figure in the American esports scene, shared a knowing grin with his colleagues. The image of Gerald, seething in anger, clenched his fist around the wooden handle of his chair. Get me a ticket to Korea, Gerald growled, his eyes burning with fury as he glared at Zachary. The sky above the house was clear, with the sun shining brightly, casting a warm glow. Jaho woke up, having just learned about the upcoming Premier League in the USA. Moonyob, still lounging on the sofa, was visibly displeased, showing his irritation by gritting his teeth while Jaho was on the phone nearby. Jaho, irritated that he hadn't been informed about the Premier League sooner, expressed his frustration over the phone. Moonyob, clearly bothered by the noise, told Jaho to take the conversation outside as it was disturbing him. Jaho, with a furrowed brow, reluctantly agreed, muttering into the phone that he understood everything. He slumped into a small chair, still clearly unhappy. The protagonist, sensing his mood, glanced over at him and asked what was bothering him. Jaho, clenched fist in hand, explained that the Premier League with the USA was scheduled in 2 weeks. Moonyob turned his gaze toward the TV, his expression indifferent. Jaho narrowed his eyes at him, his frustration building. He mentioned how everything had escalated because of what Moonyob had said to Gerald during the interview. The protagonist's brows furrowed as he looked at Jaho, sensing the tension. Jaho crossed his arms and glared at him, recalling the provocative words Moonyob had said, specifically the part where he had mentioned burying Gerald in the garden. Moonyob only responded with a dismissive attitude, claiming it was all childish behavior. Jaho wasn't convinced and grew even more frustrated. He reminded Moonyob that it was his words that had set Gerald off, especially the part where Yob had openly stated that Gerald wasn't even in the top 3 players. Jaho pointed out that now Gerald was clearly looking for a fight with Moonyob. Since Moonyob wasn't a player in the battle, Jaho feared Gerald would direct his anger toward their team instead. Moonyob, leaning back with his head resting in his hand, still seemed unfazed, questioning what any of it had to do with the players. He referred to Gerald as a scoundrel with little concern. Jaho, shaking his head in disbelief, muttered how unlucky they were, clearly frustrated by the situation. Moonyob, remaining indifferent, lay back on the couch, nonchalantly watching TV. He gave Jaho a sarcastic wish for good luck, telling him he would mess around on his behalf. Jaho, now genuinely angry, suddenly jumped up from the couch, directing an indignant look at Moonyob. Moonyob, continuing his nonchalant attitude, commented that if the Premier League was coming up, then Heian would likely be around soon too. Jaho, though still irritated, didn't argue and nodded. Just as he finished speaking, Heian entered the house, kicking off her white sneakers and calling out to her mother. The sudden slam of the door startled Moonyob, causing him to widen his eyes in surprise. As soon as he saw her, a smile spread across his face, relieved and happy to see her. Heian, carrying a suitcase, explained she had rushed home as soon as she heard Moonyob was back and was eager to see him and her father. She removed her glasses and asked her mother where Moonyob was. Sui pointed toward the living room, where the protagonist was standing. He waved slightly, a faint smile on his lips. Heian beamed with joy, her face lighting up at the sight of him. Without another word, she rushed toward Moonyob, leaping into his arms. Though slightly surprised by her enthusiasm, Moonyob couldn't help but smile as Heian hugged him tightly. She was full of energy and joy, her eyes sparkling as she clung to him. Moonyob, still smiling, gently patted her head, telling her that she was no longer a little girl and that she nearly knocked him over. Heian, still grinning, expressed how happy she was that Munhwa had really come back. He smiled, ruffling her hair, commenting that he thought she might have forgotten him by now. But Heian, still smiling brightly, replied that she could never forget him, recalling how he always played with her, gave her chocolates, and treated her kindly when her parents didn't have the time. Munhwa looked at her affectionately, noting how much she had grown, surprised by how quickly children mature. Heian, now sitting beside him, proudly declared that she was 23 years old, her voice full of pride. The protagonist sat with his arm resting on the armrest, eyes fixed on Heian, who sat nearby, her smile wide, revealing her teeth. "So, you came here because of the Premier League?" he asked. Heian's eyes sparkled with excitement as she replied, "Well, yes, but I also came to see you. The league is just a bonus." She shifted a little closer, her curiosity piqued. "Wait, is it true that you're not interested in esports?" she asked, her mouth slightly agape in surprise. The protagonist's expression hardened, irritation flaring up as he rested his head against his hand, clearly displeased. He knew exactly what had happened. Yahello had probably told Heian that he wasn't into it. He pursed his lips, embarrassed, and pointed vaguely at the TV. "I have other things to focus on," he muttered. Heian, not understanding his indifference, scooted closer, her fingers gently clasping his hand. She pulled him slightly, asking if he really wouldn't go if she asked. Without hesitation, he replied, "I wouldn't." Heian puffed out her cheeks in mock offense, narrowing her eyes at him. "You're not the same as before," she said. The protagonist furrowed his brows, bared his teeth, and shot back, "Maybe it's because we've all changed." With a frustrated sigh, Heian turned her back to him, her posture deflated. "You always did what I asked," she said wistfully. "But..." The protagonist was quick to retort, "I bought you cookies and snacks, didn't I?" Heian's eyes widened in excitement at the mention of treats. She brightened, a playful smile forming as she approached him. Crossing his arms, the protagonist looked at her with a raised brow. "What now?" he asked. "I need you to help me with an avatar association test," Heian said, her tone earnest. The protagonist, puzzled, knitted his eyebrows together. "What exactly does that even mean?" he muttered, clearly confused. Heian, her hands clasped together in front of her, gave him an exaggerated pleading look, batting her lashes. "Please, could you at least help me? Yahello's busy and can't." Reluctantly, the protagonist sighed, agreeing, Fine. But where do we even go for this?" With a mischievous glint in her eyes, Heian smiled and told him, "You'll see soon. Enough." The day was clear as they arrived at the grand building of the Korea Superhuman Battle Association. The protagonist followed behind Heian, who walked confidently toward a man standing by a row of computers. The administrator greeted them and gestured for them to follow him. As they entered the room, the protagonist took in the surroundings, intrigued by the high-tech setup. The administrator directed Heian toward a chair where a helmet was placed. "We'll begin by checking your weapons and armor," he explained. Heian placed her weapon next to the chair and took the helmet, setting it on her head with a grin. "I'm ready," she said confidently, her eyes sparkling. The protagonist stood behind the administrator, watching closely as the screen flickered to life. He raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised at what he saw. Heian, now fully immersed in the simulation, asked, "Are you watching?" The administrator gave a slight nod, and before long, a holographic monster appeared in front of Heian. It was a massive black creature that resembled a wolf, its eyes glowing with intensity. Heian's eyes gleamed as she readied herself. The administrator turned to the protagonist. "Superhuman combat is a virtual sport," he explained, raising his hand slightly. "Using advanced technology, we generate monsters, dungeons, and entire virtual worlds for our players." The protagonist looked closely at the monitor as the monster bared its teeth, its stance aggressive. He muttered to himself, "Impressive. Let's see how good she really is." Without warning, the monster lunged at Heian, who quickly narrowed her eyes and raised her weapon. She slashed at the creature, her weapon gripping its neck in one swift motion. The monster recoiled, clearly surprised by her speed. With a determined look, Heian leapt into the air, sword raised high. The creature, desperate, reached for her neck, but she was already in motion. With a clean swing, she decapitated the monster, sending a white aura flaring out from the impact. Heian landed gracefully, smiling with satisfaction as the monster's hologram dissolved. The administrator nodded, impressed. "Synchronization complete. You're free to leave," he said. Heian, her teeth bared in a playful grin, jumped from her seat and dashed over to the protagonist. "Well, what did you think?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. The protagonist gave her a thumbs up, a wicked grin tugging at his lips. "You were great," he said, though Heian's disapproving look told him that she wasn't fully satisfied with the response. She folded her arms, clearly expecting more praise, but the protagonist merely smirked, enjoying the playful tension between them. The protagonist leaned back slightly, crossing his arms as he watched Heian. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and her voice carried a playful challenge as she sarcastically complimented his skills. "Not bad for a 6-year-old, she teased, grinning. "You've got potential." Her words, though lighthearted, irked him. "Well, if you think that's impressive, why don't you give it a try yourself?" Heian shot back, her finger pointing directly at him. The protagonist bared his teeth, his patience wearing thin. He stepped back, not wanting to entertain her provocation. He had already made it clear that he wasn't interested. "I already told you I'm not competing," he muttered, irritation creeping into his tone. Heian didn't back down. "You don't have to compete," she said, her expression softening into something more hopeful. "Just try it, please." She clasped her hands together, lifting them toward her chin as she gave him a pleading look. He could see the earnestness in her eyes. Heian's voice softened and she added, "I've heard so much about your strength from my dad. I've always wanted to see it with my own eyes." There was a touch of sadness in her voice, as though she was holding back something deeper. "I grew up never seeing you fight," she continued, her gaze shifting away. "By the time I was born, you were already gone." Her words hung in the air, a mix of regret and longing that caught the protagonist off guard. He studied her face for a moment, noticing the subtle way her eyebrows furrowed, the hint of sorrow in her expression. He exhaled, clearly uncomfortable. "Fine," he finally agreed, his tone softer. "Just this once." Heian's face lit up, her excitement impossible to hide. "Thank you," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Only because you asked," the protagonist added, his expression softening, though his arms remained crossed. The administrator, who had been silently watching, took the opportunity to speak up. "If you're interested, we can do an aptitude test. First, before moving on to the avatar creation." The protagonist turned his gaze toward the man, his expression unreadable. Heian, however, beamed. "It's gonna be so cool," she said, practically bouncing on her heels. The protagonist gave a quiet sigh and slipped his hands into his jacket pockets. "Do I have to sit in the chair?" he asked, his tone flat. The administrator smiled slightly, explaining that if the protagonist chose not to compete, they could jump straight into the avatar creation. "But if you're going to test your abilities, you should at least get properly equipped first." Heian nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds awesome." The protagonist glanced at the man, sizing up the situation. "What do I need to do?" The administrator gestured toward 2 workers who were dragging over a spear and shield, their movement sluggish. "If you're going to test your skills, you'll need a weapon," he explained. "We provide standard gear for this kind of test." Protagonist lifted the spear without much effort, noting the lightness of the weapon. The workers, clearly exhausted, barely seemed to care. "These are stand-in weapons," the administrator explained. "Players usually customize their gear, but for training purposes, we have to use standard models." The protagonist raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Moonyob, standing beside him, looked less than impressed. "These are nothing like what I used to train with," he muttered, tossing the shield aside. "But I'll manage." His irritation was evident as he slung the spear over his shoulder. The administrator smiled, a little amused by Moonyob's impatience. "If you're comfortable, we can begin the test," he suggested. Moonyob didn't need any more encouragement. He dropped into a chair, the heavy helmet being placed on his head with a sigh. As soon as the helmet was in place, the system windows materialized in front of him. The protagonist watched closely, his mind already working as he tried to figure out what the battle would entail.